Beatrice grows up in a family where silence is the law. When she finally finds the courage to express her opinions, she is systematically isolated and punished. But what her family doesn't know is that while they exclude her from dinners and decisions, she is building an empire that will change the rules of the game forever. It's a compelling narrative of personal reinvention in which the weight of imposed silence ultimately becomes the force propelling a silent yet devastating revenge. Subscribe to our channel to not miss true stories of revenge, justice, and personal rebirth. My name is Beatrice Martinelli, and I learned to speak at the age of 23. Not because I was mute, but because in my family, women's silence was as sacred a tradition as Sunday Mass. On the night that everything changed, we were sitting around the kitchen table in our home in Verona. The smell of my mother's ragu filled the air, mingling with the scent of fresh basil growing on the windowsill. My father, Roberto, sat at the head of the table like an emperor on his throne, discussing with my older brother, Matteo, the sale of the family land in Sove. For 150,000 euros, Dad said, drumming his fingers on the worn wooden table. That's a good offer. We can invest it all in expanding the company. Matteo nodded enthusiastically, even though we all knew he had never worked a day in his life in the family import-export business. He preferred to spend his days at the bar with friends betting on the horses. My younger sister, Elena, looked at me from across the table. In her eyes I saw the same silent anger that was boiling inside me. That land had belonged to my grandmother Lucia, the only woman in the family who had ever encouraged me to study, to think, to exist beyond the role of obedient daughter. That land is worth at least twice as much, I said, putting my fork down on my plate. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Dad turned slowly to me as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. What did you say? He swallowed, but I didn't back down. I said it's worth double. I've seen similar ads online. Land with that location and that view of the hill sells for at least 300,000 euros and with vineyards already planted. Beatrice, Mom's voice was a cold warning. It's not for women. It's a matter of common sense. Mom, Grandma left us that land as an inheritance, not as a commodity to be sold off. Matteo laughed, a harsh, contemptuous sound. Listen to the teacher. Because you have a degree in economics, do you think you know everything? I think I can read numbers better than someone who failed high school math, I replied, and immediately regretted my words when Dad's face turned red with anger. Dad's fist slammed down on the table with such force that the glasses shook. This house, not you. Women don't contradict men. They don't argue about business. And they certainly don't disrespect their brothers. I'm not keeping quiet. His voice filled the kitchen like a clap of thunder. Starting tomorrow, you will learn what respect is. No more family dinners until you understand your position. I stood up from my chair, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst. My position? I'm a grown woman with a master's degree, father, not a child to be punished. Then you leave, he stated with a flat, deadly tone. My place. I'm a grown woman with a master's degree. If you're that grown up, go live on your own, but don't expect anything from me. Elena touched my arm, her eyes filling with tears. Bea, please. But I had already gone too far to turn back. I grabbed my bag and walked out into that March night, leaving behind the warmth of the house and the smell of the ragu that I wouldn't eat again for years. She spent that night sleeping in her car, a rather old 1998 Panda, a gift from her mother upon her graduation. The next morning I showed up to work wearing the same clothes as the day before, my eyes red from the tears I had finally allowed myself to shed in the dark. I was working as a junior financial analyst for a small consulting firm in Verona. The salary was modest, just enough to afford a studio apartment in the suburbs. But that morning, while I was preparing reports for clients who earned what I earned in a year and what they earned in a month, I made a decision. If my family had rejected me for speaking the truth then, I would have harnessed that truth to construct something which they would be unable to ignore. In the months that followed, I worked like a woman possessed. During the day, I was the silent analyst that no one noticed. In the evenings and on weekends, I studied the Veneto real estate market, analyzed trends, identified opportunities, slept 4 hours a night, and survived on coffee and sandwiches from the bar downstairs from the office. My family didn't call me, even once. During those months, she discovered through a mutual acquaintance that her father had sold her grandmother's land for exactly euro 150,000 euros. The property was bought by a businessman from Padua who sold it 6 months later for euro 420,000 euros after he had obtained all the necessary permits for the construction of a luxury farm resort. Matteo used his share of the inheritance to buy a new BMW and pay off his gambling debts. Elena, ever obedient, put her money in an account that her father controlled for safety. I continued to work and study and plan. A year after that dinner, I had saved over 30,000 euros. Not much, but enough to get started. I used that money as a down payment for a small apartment that was being renovated in the historic center of Verona. It was a ruin, but it had potential. I renovated it myself on weekends, learning how to break tiles, paint walls, and install bathroom fixtures. When I sold it 6 months later, I made euro 40,000 euros. It had begun. With that money, I bought 2 smaller apartments, renovated them, rented them out, and then bought more. Within 3 years, I had a portfolio of 15 properties in Verona, Vicenza, and Padua. I had hired 2 permanent workers and was collaborating with architects and interior designers. At 26, I was a millionaire, and my family didn't know anything about it. Write in the comments what you would have done, and don't forget to subscribe. I stayed with a consulting company, working there and keeping a very low profile. I still drove the trusty old Panda, preferring modest clothing. My home was a small apartment located above one of the buildings I'd renovated. No one suspected that Beatrice Martinelli and BM Investments, the real estate company that was quickly becoming well-known in Veneto, were the same person. I used corporate documents in the name of a holding company and conducted all business through my accountant, a discreet man in his 60s who appreciated my work ethic and didn't ask questions. It was during this period that Elena called me. It had been 3 years since that dinner. Bia. Her voice was cracking with tears. I need help. We met at a bar near Piazza Erbe. Elena looked 10 years older. She was 24, but she looked much older, with dark circles under her eyes and shaking hands as she lifted her coffee cup. Dad lost everything, she whispered. The company went bankrupt. Matteo stole from the till to pay off his gambling debts. They were about to lose their house. She felt something twist in her chest, but it wasn't pity. It was something else, something colder. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Could you lend me something? I know what you've saved up for. Even euro 10,000 euros would help us. Elena, I stopped her gently. Do you know what Dad told me the last time we saw each other? She looked down, told me to leave, that I wouldn't get anything from the family, and that's what happened. For 3 years, no one called me. No one asked me how I was, if I was eating, if I had a place to sleep. I know, but where were you when I slept in the car? The times I was eating plain pasta for a week straight just to save money, and then the time I had the flu and was alone for 3 days with a temperature of 40 degrees. Those were the moments Elena's tears flowed freely. I was scared. Dad had said that if we helped you, we would end up the same way. I nodded slowly. I understand. And now that he needs you, suddenly I'm part of the family again. Bea, please. No. The word came out with more force than I intended. The answer is no. I got up to leave, but Elena grabbed my wrist. At least come to dinner on Sunday. Let Dad see that you're okay. Maybe he'll change his mind. Against my better judgment, I accepted. The following Sunday, I parked the Panda in front of the house where I had grown up. The plaster was peeling. The flower bed was overgrown with weeds. I noticed the partially torn notice of foreclosure on the door. Mom opened it, and for a moment said nothing. Then she hugged me so tightly I couldn't breathe. You're so thin, she muttered. You don't eat enough. I was actually in perfect health, but I didn't correct her. Dad was sitting in an armchair in the living room, looking 20 years older. His hair completely gray, his shoulders hunched. Matteo wasn't there. He's at the bar, Elena explained, seeing my gaze. He didn't want to see you. We sat down at the table. Mom had prepared my favorite dish, tortellini, in broth, but the atmosphere was so tense that I had trouble swallowing così. Then, Dad finally said without looking at me, Elena says you've saved something. Here we were, No apologies. Nothing. We missed you. Nothing. We're sorry. Just interest. On my money. I've saved something, I confirmed. The company is going through difficulties, she continued, still without looking at me. If you could lend me your 25,000 euros, temporarily, of course, we could get back on our feet. How much do you owe? I asked. For the first time, she looked at me. You're 150,000 euros. Between bank debts, suppliers, and other things. Matteo's gambling debts. Got it. And if I gave you this money, what would change? He looked confused. What would change? Would we save the company? No, I said quietly. What would change between us? Would you finally be enough? Would I finally be heard? Mom interjected. Beatrice, this is not the time for these discussions. Family comes first. Family comes first, I repeated. Interesting. Where was this family when you threw me out of the house, Dad? You threw yourself out with your mouth, he replied sharply. A daughter doesn't talk to her father like that. A father doesn't treat his daughter like that, I replied, standing up. I'm sorry for your difficulties. Really? But can I help you? Can't you or won't you? Dad's voice was full of venom. Both. I left them in the same silence that had accompanied me for years. 2 months later, I received a call from my accountant. Beatrice, there's an interesting opportunity. A commercial property went up for auction. A historic building in the center of Verona, in default on its mortgage. It belongs to the Martinelli Import-Export Company. My heart stopped. My family's. Yes, the auction is in 3 days. Starting price euro 200,000. Market value at least 400,000. It could be a great investment. I closed my eyes. I knew what it meant. If no one had picked up that debt at auction, the bank would have proceeded with a total seizure. My family would have lost everything. And what would you have done in my place? I spent those 3 sleepless nights pacing the apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of person I would have become with that decision. On the day of the auction, I showed up dressed in a sober suit, my hair tied back, sunglasses. There were 5 potential buyers in the room. None of them were in my family. The auction began. 200,000, 210, 220. 250,000, I said when the others slowed down. Guess 260, a man in a blue jacket replied. 300,000. My voice was steady. Silence. The auctioneer looked around. 300,000 once. 300,000 times. Sold. I was officially the owner of my father's company. A week later, my father found out who had won the auction. Elena called me hysterical. How could you? How could you do this to him? I didn't do anything to him, I replied calmly. I made a business investment. They can stay on as tenants if you want. The rent will be fair. You planned all this, didn't you? You waited until we went broke to buy us. No, Elena. I built something from scratch while you ignored me. You built your own ruin, alone. He hung up. The day I went to view the building, Dad was there. He was loading boxes into a van, his back hunched, the slow movements of a defeated man. When he saw me, he dropped the box. Across the dusty yard, we exchanged a long, lingering look. Finally, he asked, his voice shaking and barely audible, "Are you happy with the outcome?" I replied, "Honestly, no, I am not. My preference," I explained, "had always been a family that respected me rather than this commercial enterprise." Then, why did you do it? I approached, stopping a few feet from him. Because you taught me that in this life you're either at the table or on the menu. You taught me that women's silence is a virtue. You taught me that my value was in obedience, not in intelligence. He shook his head. I just wanted to protect you. Protect me from what, Dad? From success? From independence? From the possibility of being more than a silent daughter? From the world? From failure? From pain? Instead, you gave me all of this and more, I said softly. You made me believe I was worthless. And you know what the worst part was? I almost believed it. He looked down. What do you want from me, Beatrice? Nothing, Dad. I don't want anything. The building is mine, but I won't throw you out. You can stay, pay fair rent, rebuild, or you can leave. It's your choice. What about us? He asked, his voice breaking. Is there still an us? I looked at the man in front of me, that emperor who had fallen from his throne, and I felt something softened inside me. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe in time it could become that. I don't know, Dad. But if you want to find out, the next time we sit down at the table together, try listening when I talk. 3 years later, the building houses the headquarters of BM Investments. On the ground floor is a real estate agency that my father runs. Elena works with me as a project coordinator. Mateo is in rehab, finally facing his demons. Mom and Dad come over for dinner every Sunday. Sometimes it's still hard, sometimes we fall back into old patterns, but now, when I talk, they listen, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because they've learned that the silence they imposed on me was the only real curse in that family, and that when I finally broke it, I found not only my voice, but also the strength to forgive those who tried to stifle it. The table in the conference room in my office is round. No one sits at the head of the table. Everyone has a voice. Everyone is heard. It's a small revolution, but it's mine. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what you think where you are watching this video. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share it with anyone who could benefit from hearing it.